you can't let people just make up their own facts. And I thought it was great when he got to the heckles, embryos, and really nailed those people for not knowing what they were talking about. So, people are entitled to their opinions, and I think it can shed a lot of light, but they're not entitled to make up their own facts. And so I thought that was really nicely done. And one question I had, when you asked that sort of rhetorical question about the people in the intelligent design movement, which of these people would you rather play poker with or have a beer with? The first time I saw that film, I thought you might be being sarcastic, because I really didn't connect with the people on the intelligent design side. I'd rather hang out with the scientists. I thought they seemed like more fun, and they were a little loud, but at least they were capable of independent thought, and they weren't so smug. So I don't know. I didn't quite buy that you'd rather hang out with the ID people. So I'll leave it there.
Well, I guess
Is that thing on? It's not even on.
I'll just switch to classroom voice and
There we go.
hit it.
There we go.
There's a lot of things that are going on in the film, and so I don't know that I would look at that and say that's talking about intelligent design. I think intelligent design is part of it, but there's a lot of other issues that I see as more insidious that are and more sort of global, that are expressing themselves, that are coming out in anti-evolutionary sort of thought.
Well, I myself wanted to have a beer with Muffy Moose. I was looking forward to that. I thought it was a wonderful film, made me laugh in a number of places, but fundamentally, I think it was confusing. The film was subtitled Evolution versus the Intelligent Design Circus, but the intelligent design is not the opposite of evolution. Intelligent design is very happy with common descent, with evolution over time, etc., as I was quoted in the beginning, but that doesn't come through in the entire film. And intelligent design did not start with William Paley 200 years ago. It started at least with Aristotle 2,000 years ago, and has had many defenders of very high intellect over the years, such as St. Augustine at this Augustinian university. Additionally, I don't think intelligent design is going away. I saw on Randy's website, somebody pointed out to me, he did a Google search on the words intelligent design and saw a peek at the Dover trial, and then it went off the charts, and he commented, well, so much for intelligent design. But if you actually go to a Google Books Ngram viewer and go in and search for intelligent design, this looks for words in books. And if you can see at the end, probably most people can't, but it's skyrocketing, and this is up past 2008.
It's a hockey stick.
Hey.
That's for tomorrow night.
I think it's going to be around. Intelligent design is teleology. It's not creationism. And the last thing I think I should say is that I hate to say it, but there are some misrepresentations in the film. And one of them is the exact thing that Ms. Flam pointed out. And in fact, a lot of biology texts at that time did have pictures of heckles embryos in them. And I even had them in my office, and I was astounded that Randy didn't ask Jonathan Wells for the textbook. He asked John Calvert, kind of by surprise, and he wasn't able to produce it at the time. But here's a picture of a schematic of heckles embryos from a current biochemistry textbook, year 2010, from my office. Here is some pages from a New York Times article on heckles embryos from the year 2001, just a few years before the film was made, quoting Bruce Alberts, the president of the National Academy of Sciences at the time, who was the lead author on a textbook called Molecular Biology of the Cell, which is the gold standard molecular biology textbook in the United States. And he had the pictures in his textbook. And he said in the article, well, he's going to remove them now that he knows this. But in addition to the picture, he has a description of why evolution or common descent would expect the embryos to look like that. And they don't. And this was the president of the National Academy of Sciences. So here he said evolutionary theory predicts that they should look nearly identical, and we find out they don't. So is that evidence against evolution or what? So it seems to me there's some actually good intellectual questions to be asked in this area.
Let's see, I'll offer a few comments. I still have a hard time taking the heckles embryos issue seriously. To me, it's like, imagine you had a presidential candidate and somebody found out that there's a rumor that he stole some kid's lunch money when he was in second grade. And maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It's so trivial, that's all I could say. I had embryology courses, and this is such a piece of trivia to haggle over. And anyhow, that's as much as I can say on it. It's just not a fundamental building block of the entire profession of embryology, the way in which it's cast by those folks. In terms of the movie itself, we premiered this at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2006. It aired on Showtime for a couple years, and it didn't get a theatrical release. At Tribeca, the distributors were not interested in it. They said it was too teachy, too educational, too dense in information, as well as not being sufficiently polarized. A lot of evolutionists, when they saw the title, said, yes, finally, the film that just beats the hell out of people like Michael Behe, Flock of Dodos. And then they sat down and watched it, and within the first 3 or 4 minutes, it's like, what's this guy doing? He's letting Behe tell all of his ideas. And in fact, my executive producer had tried to get me to cut you off and explain every single thing you said, why it's wrong, and that just wasn't the approach of the film. It's hard to explain that to very literal-minded people. But one of the most fascinating things about the film was that it is dense in information, and the number of people who saw it once in the very beginning and wrote me emails saying they saw it 3 or 4 months later, and they said, I really like the changes you've made in the film. It was never changed. They saw a different film the second time around because the first time they thought that they were going to see a movie that was the big informational attack on evolution, and then they said, what the hell is this? The second time around, they came with different expectations. Oh, this is more about communication than it is about science. And so that's the bottom line on that. And you've heard enough from me in the film, so I will hand it back to you.
Thank you. All right, let's have some rich conversation, some questions.
For Dr. Behe, it seems to me that the history of progress in our civilization has been solving problems that we didn't understand. And along the way, if we had said, okay, now we know everything there is to know, and everything we don't know, we're never going to know, we wouldn't have continued to progress. It seems that what you're saying is, gosh, I don't understand this complexity that exists. We don't have an answer for it today. Therefore, I need to bring in this deus ex machina mechanism to answer this question that we have. It doesn't seem that you're showing the humility that science requires us to have at each step along the way to say, this is what we know. What we don't know yet, it's because of our ignorance. It's not because it can't be known. It's not because it won't be known. And you're saying, I don't get it now, therefore it can't be gotten.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. That comes up a lot. Sorry. I don't see it that way. I don't think intelligent design is saying, gee, I don't know, this is so complex, I don't understand it, so God must have done it, We don't do that in science, you're right. For example, there was a problem 10 years ago with the number of neutrinos coming from the sun. There was only half as much as theory predicted. Nobody said it's because God was holding back neutrinos or that was, nobody inferred to design there. We infer to design when we see a purposeful arrangement of parts, such as in a mousetrap. We see a number of parts separately arranged. Well, that's the dictionary definition. And we have seen this in life now. And we deduce design from that positive, empirical, physical evidence. And we have experience doing it. We detect design every day. Every day you go down the street. Look to the left, look to the right, you can see things that were designed, things were not. Additionally, you get into a muddle when you say, you're just saying that we don't understand something and therefore we're going to say God did it. Because in the history of science, there have been other examples where people have proposed new ideas and have been accused of just saying, well, you're giving up on the current paradigm. And one of them was the Big Bang Theory. It used to be thought 100 years ago that the universe was eternal and unchanging, and then motions of the galaxies were recorded, and that gave rise eventually to the Big Bang Theory. And a lot of people thought that that had theological, philosophical implications. And a lot of people, including a lot of scientists, hated that. And there were some scientists who said that science, by definition, requires an eternal universe. And so what if those scientists had managed to win out and say, let's not give up on trying to explain these Hubble shifts of the galaxies within the framework of an eternal universe. Maybe in 50 years or 100 years we'll come along and let's give it the old college try. Don't give up and say that the universe had a beginning. Well, they could have done that, but they would have been out of a lot of good science in the meantime. So my idea is that science is supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And if it's leading this way and this looks teleological, well, so be it. If it goes this way and it strikes some people as teleological, follow the evidence wherever it goes. And science only gets in trouble when it refuses to follow the evidence because of some philosophical preconceptions.
Any comments from the other panelists?
Actually, I have one. I used to write about cosmology in my previous job at Science, and I think that analogy actually breaks down because the Big Bang Theory doesn't say anything about a supernatural entity starting the Big Bang, so there actually is no theological implication unless you add one, that the actual scientific Big Bang Theory is not a theological idea. It's a perfectly natural explanation for things, and it's supported by a lot of evidence. So that's why scientists are on board with it and why they're not going to get on board with intelligent design, because it's not supported by any evidence. But there's actually a lot of really powerful evidence for the Big Bang. Thank you.
Okay, second question.
Sir?
Yeah, I have several issues with intelligent design, just to run a few of them. First, you show a beautiful picture of the eye as an example of intelligent design. But our arts of design, such as blind spot in our eye, where the optic nerve comes in, it's called macula. Octopi don't have that. Right, that's a flaw in design. Why would an intelligent designer do that? Why would an intelligent designer design a system where over 99% of all species that have ever existed have gone extinct? They weren't intelligently designed. Why was a universe designed where we couldn't survive in 99.99% of that universe? And finally, a mousetrap is not a mouse.
I agree. Okay, those are good points, but let me tell you what sort of objections they are to intelligent design. They're theological objections. You're saying that no designer, if God's the designer, God wouldn't have made the eye like that. He would have made it better. He would have made it the way I did. Sure, it functions. Sure, the vertebrate eye has blind spots, and it's the eye that an eagle uses to see a mouse, miles away. So it's pretty dang functional. But one decides, and a number of people have had the same objection, one decides that if I were God, I wouldn't have made it like that. It does not answer the question, could the eye have arisen without intelligent input by random variation, as Charles Darwin said, and natural selection? It has absolutely nothing to do with that. And so it's not a scientific objection to intelligent design, it's a theological one.
Can I do something here? So, I haven't seen him for 7 years since we did the movie, so this is kind of a fun opportunity for me. And, you've been through years of doing these sorts of things, and everybody trying to play chess with you and get a checkmate out of you on, gotcha on the intelligent design stuff. Let me just ask you, sort of in interview mode, can you tell us for a few minutes about, you were one of the key people at the Dover trial. I remember there was a cartoon caricature of you in the New Yorker, wasn't there? And just tell us a little bit, how did that experience go for you overall?
Oh, it was great. It was great. If anybody, was looking for the perfect vacation, 3 days on the witness stand with lawyers in your face, you can't beat it. It's interesting. I had never been in a courtroom, at least for a trial before, even though my brother is an assistant U.S. attorney in the same building as that trial took place. I didn't know what to expect, but after the trial was over, I felt that I had an inkling of something like this that I had read before. Has anybody here, you must know, Nancy, you're in English? History. Oh, history. That's just about the same thing, isn't it? Anybody here ever read Franz Kafka's The Trial? Okay, well, that's what it was like. What I experienced inside the courtroom, I saw had absolutely no relationship to what was reported outside the courtroom, and
How so? What was the divide?
What was the divide? I went on and explained intelligent design for long periods of time, gave analogies to the Big Bang Theory. None of that was reported. One thing I was asked, for 30 seconds, somebody said, well, is astrology science? And, when you get into the subject, you think historically, you say, well, yes. In the Middle Ages, actually, astrology was a respectable study. After all, if the moon and sun could affect the tides, what else might they affect? And so I naively said, yeah, because back then it was a scientific pursuit. I did not say that I thought astrology with gypsies with scarves and so on was a science today. And that was all that was in the newspapers. Behe says intelligent design is the same as astrology, or
Was
something.
that was the biggest distortion? That?
In the newspapers, yes. And in the judge's opinion, I was surprised to see that, in fact, he didn't write any of the opinion that dealt with the expert testimony. Turns out that in a trial, after the trial's over, the lawyers for the two sides give the judge essentially a version of the decision that they hope he will adopt. And he looks at them and generally writes his own opinion, maybe using one or both as guides. This guy essentially copied everything from the plaintiff's, the ACLU lawyer's document into his own, cleaning up a couple of errors of grammar and so on, whenever he talked about the expert witnesses. When he talked about my testimony, when he talked about Ken Miller, who was the biochemist for the other side, when he talked about his testimony, when he talked about philosophers, the academic philosophers and theologians.
So you felt that you felt that even though he was a Republican Bush appointee conservative, you felt he was an activist judge?
No, I think.
Which is what the Discovery Institute said.
Well, I occasionally have opinions that are not identical to the Discovery Institute. I think he didn't understand pretty much anything. And nonetheless, when you have one side which is endorsed by the National Academy of Sciences and National Institutes of Health and every other science organization, and on the other side you have me, The decision is easy, I
All right,
think.
well, I will differ. I was on a panel with him 3 years ago at GSA, and I kind of felt like he understood everything. But that said, one last little question if I can ask you. What has happened with the Discovery Institute and specifically Bruce Chapman in the years since the Dover trial? Can you give us a synopsis of what they have done in following that?
Yeah, we've continued the work. The Discovery Institute is a think tank that encompasses a wide range of issues. It was originally set up as a think tank for regional issues of the Northwest and didn't take on the issue of intelligent design until Bruce Chapman, the president of the Discovery Institute, read a story in the Wall Street Journal, or an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, about a man named Dean Kenyon, who was a professor at San Francisco State University, who was being kicked out of his biology class for talking about intelligent design. And their mission, or their overriding goal, is to defend people, especially academics and teachers, who wish to talk about either problems with evolution that are admitted in the evolution literature, and also talk about alternatives to evolution.
And are they still doing that much?
They are. Yeah, they've got several cases on trial right now. There have been 5 states or so that have entertained legislation in the past couple years, and the Discovery has assisted them.
Michigan?
I don't know if I can talk loudly enough, but
First of all, I take my relationship with God pretty seriously, so it doesn't seem impossible that there could be something else besides random mutation. But I am not an evolutionary biologist, so the second thing, astrology is a tool, and there have been scientific research done on astrology. You just have to read about it. It's not a belief system, but 2 things I wanted to ask you. The thing about Mount Rushmore, that to us as human beings, that's obviously designed. But what if an extraterrestrial looked at it that didn't look anything like us? They might look at it and think it was just happened naturally, or by laws of physics, I guess. So I wondered about that. And then what was my other question? Oh, darn. Oh, I wondered what scientific studies you're proposing that will, what sort of science are you proposing to prove that there's intelligent design? Or, I'm not sure how to phrase that question, but yeah. What more do you have on it, about it?
Or maybe you can phrase it, is there a way to prove intelligent design through science?
Yeah, that does concern me a little bit, because, like, in a sense, you'd have to prove the existence of God, and does that really do anything for us in the field of science?
Well, first of all, I feel slightly embarrassed that I'm getting all these questions. But I'll answer it anyway.
You're the star.
Let's see, what was the first thing that...
Here's the thing. I mean, I'm 47. I've learned about evolution, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of, something about that. But I don't know anything about if there's scientific research or what intelligent design is. I'm pretty sure that the planet is not 6,000 years old. I'm not a strict Bible person, and I worked at the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania in archaeology and ethnographic museum. It makes me nervous to talk like this too. So we don't have anybody but you to hear this from.
Yeah, well, okay, if the question is there scientific evidence for design, I argue yes, there is. The scientific evidence is the structure of the biological systems themselves that we have discovered. In particular, I'm a biochemist, so the cellular and molecular systems that have been discovered in the past 50 years, which are astoundingly sophisticated and were predicted by absolutely no one before they were discovered. And as I said, we have experience in recognizing intelligently designed systems. We see it all the time. And so we can recognize intelligence from the empirical evidence, which is the structures of the systems themselves, and by inductive reasoning, by understanding what it is that we recognize when we see an intelligently designed system. Intelligent design can also be falsified. And as a matter of fact, ever since my first book came out 15 or so years ago, people have been pointing to experiments or doing experiments trying to do exactly that. Say, no, this system does not require intelligent agency to develop it. It could have developed by random variation and natural selection. If that were shown for some system of good complexity, then my ideas would be shot down. But in my opinion, that has not happened yet.
Hold on for a second. I'm going to ask, is there anybody under the age of 25 who'd like to ask a question?
Excuse me, can I just follow up on that?
I'm coming back for you, though. Get ready.
I mean, to a large extent, I think that's smoke and mirrors. I mean, really, to say that something, you can't imagine how a structure could get to the way it is really ridiculous. I mean, you've got billions of years of evolution. Nothing says that structure did what it does now all the way along. You've got all sorts of, I'm trained as an anatomist, a comparative anatomist. Your shoulder muscle, your trapezius muscle was a gill muscle if you were a shark. And it's something that if you look at a human today and you didn't know anything about evolution, you didn't know what other organisms were built like, you'd wonder, how could that possibly have had such a completely different function? And I think science is full of these things. Just because we can't see it, I think it's an absolute cop-out to say it can't be. I have no problem with somebody saying, I can't see it, but to say that's an answer, I mean, it's a cop-out is what it is, I think. I'm sorry, I can't see it as anything but science versus non-science. I mean, that's what it boils down to me.
Can I just make a brief comment? And if my shoulder muscle was what was it, a shark's gill or something like that?
Levator muscle for a
Okay.
gill,
Well, I don't care. I mean, that has nothing to do with intelligent design. That's an issue of common descent. Maybe it was, okay? But intelligent design has no issue with common descent. The only aspect of evolutionary theory that intelligent design deals with is the claim that these changes and these systems can be built up by random mutations and natural selection. And if you look in the literature, there have been a number of evolutionary scientists who have done laboratory evolution experiments. And the longest running one is being done by a man named Richard Lenski at Michigan State University, where he has grown 50,000 generations of a bacterium named E. coli. And at the end of his experiment, after 50,000 generations, he's seen a number of beneficial mutations. What are they? Has a new flagellum been produced? Has something else? No, it turns out that there have been a dozen genes thrown away, broken. Turns out that was beneficial in the environment that those bacteria were in. Other ones seem to have been degraded, and some he hasn't been able to track down yet. But from our best evidence, it seems that random mutation breaks things a lot more easily than it makes things, and sometimes breaking things helps. So ID is only concerned with that one claim of Darwin, that it's random mutation. Common descent, that's great, you know. I'd much rather be descended from, you know,
All right,
chimps than
let me say a
who
few
I
words
am
here,
descended
because
from.
there's such,
Randy, quickly.
well, wait a second. There's,
What do you get to some young questions?
okay, but there's such an element of dishonesty in this argument of intelligent design, and the word random is being used in two contexts. So natural selection takes place via two steps. There is a variation step, and that the word random is used there, but it really means omnidirectional, that there's no directional movement to the variation. And then there's this very deterministic step of selection that comes in. And the intelligent design folks use this word random as a buzzword to try and say that evolution is random and directionless like that. But it's just conflating the two things back and forth, and it's not scientifically honest. It isn't.
It's not conflating it. You have to ask yourself, what are the mutations that natural selection deterministically can select? Okay, well, it turns out that one good mutation that gives a great selective advantage in Richard Lenski's experiments with E. coli is throwing away the genes to make a flagellum, because in his stirred flask, the bacteria don't have to swim. Okay, and deterministically, natural selection selects that. And deterministically, it has selected bacteria that have thrown away their operon for making ribose. And deterministically, it's selected a bunch of other genes that have been broken. Okay, so the question is not whether natural selection works. I'm happy to concede natural selection will select something if it gives a benefit to the organism. The question is this random mutation, and random in that context is exactly right on. Can random changes in a functioning genome build something new and complex? And if it can, we haven't seen it yet, and we've seen a process that looks pretty much like the opposite.
Okay, our next question.
Actually, can everyone just hear me without the microphone?
No.
No, okay. All right, so we'll just move on to maybe instead of debating if intelligent design is right or wrong or disproven or whatnot, I think the main issue in the documentary, or one of the main issues in the documentary was why are the laws coming in and why exactly are people, you know, why are we doing trials and why are we trying to get this into the school system as being like a controversy? And I don't think that intelligent design is going away, just like religion isn't going to go away at any point. It's more a fact that that it is a philosophical question and doesn't really belong in, say, the science classroom. And I don't think it really does, because it is one of those things where it's like, if we can't fill the hole, there's a designer, which is not natural, but it is supernatural. So I think there's the big problem and the disconnect here between scientists who are evolutionists and people who are scientists and say they're intelligent design proponents. And so I guess anyone can open up the floor with that one. So should it be, you know,
Dave, you want
incorporated
to
into
take a
classes?
shot at answering that? The question is, should it?
Okay, sure.
What did you say, Faye?
Faye.
Faye, yes. There we
I
go.
could take that on. I mean, I think that that you're right that the an open question in science doesn't give you evidence that something new supernatural happened. And even if there was something that was so complex nobody could figure out quite how it evolved, that there's no evidence there that a supernatural thing came in and did some sort of magical thing. So, yeah, it shouldn't be taught in science. If people want to teach something about the history of philosophy or the history of religion and want to talk about Aristotle and talk about Paley and some of these philosophical ideas in some other class, that's fine. But there is no positive evidence for intelligent design, so it's not a science.
Want a different opinion? I'm a simple guy. I don't know anything about the Constitution, but I don't think the Constitution mentioned science class or English class or philosophy class in school. And yet some people say, well, it's okay to teach intelligent design and philosophy, but not science. Well, why? To my mind, I think it's pedagogically best that when you bring up a subject, such as where did life come from, how did life develop, that it's best to discuss, the dominant views on this. Certainly, it's a dominant view in science that Darwin's theory can explain it all, but 90% of the public of the United States disagrees. Do any of them have any cogent reasons for disagreeing? And if they do, well, then maybe that could be discussed in talking about the origin of life and the development of life as well.
You go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would say the reason why I think it's very, very wrong to teach it in a science class is, I mentioned at the outset this idea of anti-intellectualism, and part of that is Americans, people around the world, but Americans more than most people around the world, don't understand the difference between science and non-science. And this causes problems. People feel that any feeling they have is justified. I don't believe it, and therefore it can't be right. I don't understand it, and therefore it can't be right. And I think that to introduce something that is blatantly non-science at the science classroom can only act to confuse kids in high school. I mean, it might be one thing at a university level to bring it up at some point and sort of say, well, we can talk about this, and is it science or is it non-science? But I think it's planting a dangerous seed to give younger children especially, who are very impressionable, this idea that these things are somehow comparable. I mean, this is a minor aside, and I'm sorry to take a second with it, but I've been here for 24 years at Villanova, and one of the reasons was I came here, I am not a religious person at all. I never thought I would come to a Catholic university, a religious university. And when I interviewed with an administrator. I asked him what they thought about evolution, and he said, you're a biologist, you teach biology. As long as you don't teach theology, we trust you to do what you do and do what you know, and that's the attitude that made me come here and stay here. And I think that attitude that says, look, faith is one thing, non-science, supernatural, that's one thing, and if you want to believe in that, that's your business. But if you start confounding that with science, that's just wrong.
Can I ask somebody who was recently in high school to add a thought to what Dr. Bauer said about this is confusing in high school? Come on, you all were in high school a couple of years ago. Sir, you were not.
Except to be teaching.
That'll be, okay, we'll come back.
And somebody on the other side put his hand up.
All right, well, what was the question again?
You're just acknowledging that you were in high school, right? The question was, Dr. Bauer said that this would be confusing, maybe on the undergraduate level, but in high school, this would be confusing. So I want you to comment on that or add some thoughts or ask him what he thinks about it.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it would necessarily, this is just for me speaking, I wouldn't say it's necessarily confusing, it's just one of the points the movie made is just this whole idea of considering both sides. And I mean, naturally, I'm a pretty devout Catholic, so I'm sort of biased regard the argument, but I do take both opinions pretty openly. I don't just necessarily rule out evolution. I'm strictly intelligent design. In fact, I mean, this is maybe the second or third time I've even heard about intelligent design. So for most of my academic career, if you want to call it, I've only known about evolution.
All right, can I say something here? All right, first off, you're a very nice man. You were nice, good sport to take part in this movie. You're a great sport to be here tonight. You are not a simple man. Your answers are unsimple. And there was commentary about that in your testimony at Dover, that people had a hard time following a lot of these answers. But let me ask you right now to address, in the movie, the most powerful part of the whole movie, the most powerful soundbite, is when Steve Case in the University of Kansas talks about the God of the gaps. And he said that soundbite, and I listened to it for a couple of months till the day finally hit me, we need to put a graphic on there of a brick wall. Because what he's pointing out there, I think, is the logical flaw in intelligent design. This idea that God lives in the gaps. And the problem with that is the smarter we get with science, the smaller your God gets, and it's anti-religious. So what is your take on that soundbite? Because I think that's kind of the aha moment for me in the movie.
Okay, you might not be surprised, but I see it differently. I see it not as an argument from ignorance or God of the gaps. I see this as an argument from knowledge. When Darwin proposed his theory, it was a good theory. It might have been true because we knew a whole lot less about biology than we do now. Even in the 1940s, before the genetic code was discovered and so on, Darwin's theories still had a good shot at explaining life. But since the 50s and 60s and so on, it's not that we've become less informed, we have become more informed. And it's the very progress of science, I say, that has led to the intelligent design movement. The flagellum, the clotting cascade, intracellular transport, the whole 9 yards, genetic
Are the gaps
code.
smaller today than they were in the 50s? Are the gaps in our knowledge smaller today than they were in the 50s?
Gaps in our knowledge. I'm not going to talk about gaps. I'm going to talk about knowledge. We know a whole lot more
This is a simple
than
yes
we.
no question. Can't you give a yes or no answer? Are the gaps in our knowledge smaller today than they were in the 1950s?
Are the gaps? These are not what's the word? Two things that can't be compared because our knowledge has exploded. So you can't compare. You might say, are our gaps in knowledge today greater or lesser than they were in the time of Aristotle? Well, that would be a hard question to answer. But we know a lot more. The argument from intelligent design comes not from saying we don't know what's in the cell, it's mysterious and therefore God did it. It comes from saying, look what's in the cell, look what we discovered. This is acting like a computer. It has a code. It's translating this into something. These are machines. Everybody calls them machines, and so on. So it's an argument from knowledge. So I would disagree with the professor who sees it as a God of the gaps argument.
And our next question here, sir, thanks for your patience.
It seems to me that this film is not just about science and non-science. It's about politics. And you made it very clear throughout this that this is being promoted. The argument is being promoted by people that have a political agenda. And as a former member of a local school board, every time this issue came up, it was framed in political terms, controlling what kids learn, preserving certain kinds of very, very conservative values, and we haven't talked about that at all in this. Of course, we have scientists up here, but it was a political document. I would offer this film to a class in political science, not just a class in science,
Well,
if I was still teaching.
And to that very point, this is what I ran into with the film. The film's not about science. It's about the politics swirling around and the communication dynamics swirling around this issue. And this is why a lot of major evolutionists said they were disappointed with the film, because we had hoped that you would go for the jugular. We had hoped you would make the case. We would hope that you would slit the throat of the creationists with this movie. That's not what I set out to do, and it's not going to happen. And exactly what you say. It's more appropriate in political science course than it is in a science class, to some extent.
Well, yeah, and the reason is, of course, is that kids have to go to public school. And so everybody's, if we were just talking about adults, there wouldn't be a controversy. You could think what you wanted to. Who cares, what the guy in the next bar stool, says. But people are concerned about the education of their children. And so parents who are concerned about the education of their children are going to get politically active. It's hard to avoid unless you don't have a public school system. Send your kids to private schools, but most people can't afford to do that, so it's inevitably political. But political is not a dirty word. Political is just how we live in this country.
I'm going to save Professor Behe from any further embarrassment by directing this question at the other three panelists. I see, first of all, what Professor Behe talks with, mentions with the knowledge gap. I think knowledge of the system has increased. We know all of the proteins in the flagella, but what is unclear, and the gap that has remained, is how a complex system like that was created. That gap, I think, remains. So my question to the three panelists is, how might one address this issue in a science class? That evolution has good explanations at some point, here are the gaps, these are the hypotheses, this is what we don't know. Has that been addressed, and how might one address that in a science, hypothesis-driven manner by scientists?
I can So are you talking about the origin of life then, when you're talking about sort of how it came about initially? Is that your...
Or specifically in this discussion, the idea of irreducible complexity. How a system, while we understand the system in great detail, we don't know how that might have evolved from simpler states.
Right, well that seems like a perfectly good, reasonable thing to discuss in a classroom then. Maybe even taking something like the origin of life, which is a question that comes up a lot in the general public and in my column, and people will say, well, you don't understand, you scientists don't understand the origin of life, therefore God must have created life. So it's actually a really, I think, an interesting area for discussion, because there's a lot of really great research on the origin of life where people are looking at how the building blocks might fit together in different ways that could create some sort of proto-life and simpler life forms. And even sort of discussing what life is and how it differs from non-life and how we would recognize it if we found it elsewhere. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of really interesting discussion that can go on about the ongoing questions in science, and that's really a lot of what I deal with as a journalist when I'm writing stories for the paper or for magazines. Is I usually am right there in the gaps, talking to different people about what they think and the experiments that are going on, the areas of active research. I mean, if they filled in all the gaps, they wouldn't have to pay scientists to do science anymore. That's really what they're doing.
I mean, I think that it's a very good question, and there are complex things out there that we don't understand. That doesn't mean that they are never going to be understandable. And there are plenty of examples of things that were not understood 100 years ago that we have a good understanding of now. There are plenty of things that, biology of 200 years ago, would be totally flabbergasted by, but we have an idea how these things work. So I think that the example of experiments being done for 20 years and saying, we don't see any of this happening. 20 years or 30 years is not 4.6 billion years. And we're not in a position to extrapolate all the things that can happen. I mean, if you can imagine, just think in terms of probability, what can happen in, a limited amount of time, a human lifespan, the lifespan of all hominids. It's nothing. It's a tiny drop of water. And if you expand that to the whole of evolutionary time, I think there's no way that you can exclude the evolution of almost any kind of complexity. I also think that the idea is a little bit ass backwards if you think about the idea of, oh, look at this, it looks like gears, or look at it looks like a computer. No, those are human constructs. You should be looking at it the other way around. We're sort of finally getting around to the using ideas that nature has come up with a long time ago. I just cannot see how anybody can eliminate the possibility of what billions of years of evolution could possibly do. We don't know what can happen in all that time, yet we look around, we see the diversity of life, and for most people, we can accept the idea that evolution has occurred, and Dr. Behe accepts that evolution has occurred in a variety of other contexts. Why can't that apply to everything? I mean, I just find it odd as a scientist to be able to say, I believe in natural phenomena, in everything I see and do in my life. I can fly in a plane and not be afraid that I'm going to just drop out of the sky. But for this thing, I have to turn to the supernatural. And as a scientist, I just can't imagine that. And I also have a hard time, just as a rational people, cannot accept that the extrapolation of everything they know and see and all the experiences they have in their life every day, why it's not easier to accept that some extrapolation of that might explain things rather than to close that avenue off and say, I must turn to a supernatural explanation.
Yeah, and I'll add some more on the same note, basically. Back in 2006, the first few screenings we had of this, all through that year, we had some really heated post-screening discussions because the issue was still on fire then. And we had 2 in California where twice we had creationists get up, and I remember this one guy who was a physicist, he said, angry old guy, and he said, the mathematicians have already figured this out. They've done the calculations. They've calculated the number of days the planet's been around and the number of cells on the planet and the number of mutations. And when you do the math, there is no possible way you could have this much diversity and all that change happening in that limited amount of time. And all this nonsense, which, at 10 o'clock at night, nobody's going to go up to the board and put the numbers out and figure out if his calculations are right or not. But more importantly, exactly what he's saying there, you can't put an upper bound on change. And when you study embryology and you look at these experiments where they take a blastula and they take one cell from one side of it and transplant it to the other side, and not only do you get a rearrangement there, but the chemical gradients change, you get all these pleiotropic and epigenetic and all these other effects, and it's so multi-level in the interactions that you can't put an upper bound on the potential for change with a single mutation or whatever. And that's where I don't know where they get this from to say, well, you can't have that much change. You can't calculate that, can you? How much is possible with change? That's my feeling.
We have a final question for the evening. Way back there, sir.
Yeah. I was wondering, this is more back to social and political views of this movie. Do you ever feel that this is just a veil for creationism, and that creationists are just riding the coattails of the popularity of this issue right now to move ahead and progress politically?
That may be the case for some people, but I'm an academic, and I'm just concerned with trying to figure out the way the world works. And I have published my own views in my own books, and as I said, I'm not a creationist. I'm a Catholic. I see teleology, and I think that science has shown design, and what other people do with that may be interesting, but that's for somebody else to concern themselves with. I'm not a politician or I'm not a politician. Sure.
Do you feel it necessary that the intelligent design camp kind of educates more of their people and educate people who are probably actually creationists?
We do. I mean, all sorts of people, I talk to all sorts of people, including young Earth creationists and so on and so forth. And I make clear what design is and where it ends and where, a religiously based argument begins, like, a 6-day creation type argument or something like that. And in my experience, most creationists, young Earth creationists even, are happy to hear of the arguments of intelligent design. And heck, for my money, I don't see why an intelligent design view can't be kind of a happy medium between people who are polarized on various sides. Like I say, you can think, you know, all of the design was infused into the Big Bang for all I care. And so I don't see why any scientists shouldn't be, you know, happy with that. And yet you can say, we can tell from empirical evidence when we look that, in fact, there is teleology, there's fine-tuning, whatever you want to call it, there's design in the world. And so I don't see why people of faith shouldn't be happy with that, at least as far as it goes in public schools. So I see ID as a kind of happy medium.
And let me say a few words on the politics you had asked about that. So intelligent design was an idea that was a flash in the pan 2005 and 6. It was driven by the Discovery Institute. Bruce Chapman was a very savvy politician. He had been in the Reagan administration, and he was the mastermind behind getting on the cover of Time magazine that you saw in the movie there. But there was a political agenda behind it. And the bigger issue that is still on fire in this country is the question of separation of church and state. There's a really good book written by Kevin Phillips that came out around 2006 when I was making this movie called American Theocracy. And he begins by making it clear this is a deeply religious nation. It has been in 1865, the time of the Civil War, it was the most Christian nation on the planet. It still is. And in the last few months, Rick Santorum spoke openly about his belief that the time has come to end this silly notion of separating church and state. There's a large faction behind that. That's the bigger issue, and it crops up in the science classroom. But the intelligent design thing, despite your graph there, my perception is media in our society is everything. And it came and went, and there's been, not only that, their spine got snapped at the Dover trial, and they really did lose a crushing defeat. The Discovery Institute came out with a book trying to attack the judge. You know, if you couldn't beat the case, let's try and beat the guy that was behind it, even though he was a conservative. And they called him an activist judge. And since then, as far as I can tell, it seems to me that Bruce Chapman, the mastermind behind it, abandoned it. I went there and showed the movie to them in the spring of 2006. And he was mad at the movie that I was talking about them having a $5 million budget, because at that point in time, they were losing a ton of funding from the Weyerhaeuser Foundation and a bunch of these other foundations who just said, enough with the intelligent design. We don't want anything to do with that. We're taking our funding away from all this transportation stuff you're doing because you're contaminating, you know, what we're involved with. So everybody backed away from the whole issue, and that's when it died. And it's, as far as I can tell, I disagree with you. I think it's been sputtering along since then. And I think there's a lot of them thinking now, what's a new package we can come up with this for the same concept as they did, because most people felt that intelligent design was a repackaging of creationism, and I think that's where it stands now.
Any final comments from?
You guys, here, we haven't heard enough from you. They,
Oh, I feel like I've said about, unless there's another question.
Did you say anything about the Tennessee issue? You wrote about that this past week.
Yeah, well, I mean, it does seem like it's sort of taken a new form. That was my sense, that, you know, intelligent design, you don't hear about it as much anymore, but a bill just became law in Tennessee that people think may allow creationism to be taught in schools. So it's a sort of a teach the controversy academic freedom bill, and it sounds very innocuous, but there are a lot of public school teachers that, according to surveys, want to teach creationism. So that's why I think some of the people that are looking at public education are really concerned about this. And I think there's also an issue of fairness, that if some kids in public school aren't really getting a proper science education, then they may miss out on opportunities later on.